The wind, a dry and restless thing, scoured Copper Hollow that afternoon, carrying the grit of red earth and the scent of distant rain that would never fall. It was a scavenger wind, and it found its prize in the delicate lace of Eliza Hart's wedding gown, the fabric meant for the hushed reverence of a church aisle, caught on the sharp, unforgiving teeth of a barbed wire fence with a sound like a final, brittle breath. A single, perfect rosebud embroidered on the bodice snagged, held for a moment, and then tore free, leaving a ragged wound in the white cotton. Eliza didn't cry out. The pain in her hand, where a barb had sliced across her palm as she scrambled through, was a dull, distant ache compared to the roaring furnace in her chest. She was running, not with the frantic panic of a startled deer, but with the grim, soul-deep purpose of a soldier retreating from a battle already lost. The dust puffed up around the hem of her ruined dress, staining it the color of rust and regret. Behind her, atop the low bluff, the white steeple of the Copper Hollow Community Church stood stark against the vast, indifferent blue of the Wyoming sky. It looked smaller now, like a child's forgotten toy. She ran along the high bank of the Copper River, its water flowing low and green over smooth, sun-bleached stones. The air still clinging to her hair was a phantom of the ceremony that never was a ghost of beeswax candles, wilting wildflowers, and the cloying sweetness of holy incense. It was the smell of a life that had been promised and then snatched away in the space of a single, shattering heartbeat. It had happened so fast. One moment, she was standing before Reverend Michaelis, her hand trembling in Sheriff Clay Royce's grasp. Clay, with his polished badge and his easy, confident smile that had charmed the entire town, and her along with it. The next, the heavy oak doors of the church had swung open, admitting not a late-coming guest, but the stooped, resolute figure of Levi Turner, the town's former sheriff. Silence had fallen, thick and heavy as a wool blanket. Levi, his face a roadmap of hard years, held a sheaf of papers in his hand. He hadn't shouted. He didn't need to. His voice, though quiet, carried the weight of undisputed truth. "This union," he'd declared, his eyes fixed not on the Reverend, but on the smug, well-dressed man in the front pew, Burke Mallory, "is a fraud." A collective gasp had rippled through the pews. Clay's hand had tightened on hers, his knuckles white. He'd tried to laugh it off, a strained, ugly sound. "Levi, you've had a bit too much sun." But Levi was relentless. He laid it all out, piece by damning piece. A land grant in her late father's name, one of the last independent parcels with true water rights along the Copper River. A grant that couldn't be sold or seized by Mallory's burgeoning rail and bank conglomerate without a legitimate family connection. A marriage, he explained, to the orphaned Eliza Hart would make Sheriff Royce that connection. The papers in Levi's hand were copies of correspondence between Mallory and Royce, outlining the entire scheme. Clay wasn't marrying a woman. He was acquiring a deed. The silence that followed was different. It was a cold, assessing quiet. The townspeople looked from Clay's reddening face to Mallory's placid, unbothered expression. And then, finally, to her. Eliza saw it in their eyes, the dawning realization, quickly followed by the shiver of pity. She was no longer Eliza Hart, the respectable seamstress and soon-to-be sheriff's wife. She was a tool, a pawn, a bargained-for item, as Levi's words had so starkly put it. A poor, jilted thing. Clay had hissed at her, his voice a venomous whisper. "Don't just stand there. Say something. Deny it." But she couldn't. The truth had the undeniable ring of a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil. She looked at the man she was about to marry and saw, for the first time, the hollow space behind his charming smile. She saw the calculation in his eyes, the same cold appraisal she'd seen in Mallory's when he discussed the price of cattle. She pulled her hand from his, the small, quiet gesture feeling as loud as a gunshot in the silent church. And then she turned and walked, not ran. down the aisle, past the rows of stunned faces, out the heavy doors, and into the scouring wind. She didn't start running until the first sob clawed its way up her throat. Now, her lungs burned. She stumbled to a halt in a thicket of cattails where a small creek fed into the river. The reeds whispered around her, their soft, rustling sound a balm to the harsh ringing in her ears. She sank to her knees, the torn dress pooling around her like sullied snow. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She wasn't just a woman left at the altar. She had been publicly unmade, her name and future bartered away for a stretch of dirt and a right-of-way for Mallory's iron horse. That was where Jonah Briggs found her. He was riding the fence line of his small ranch, the one parcel Mallory hadn't yet managed to swallow. Tucked into a bend of the river, his horse, a sturdy buckskin named Burak, stopped short, ears pricked forward. Jonah followed the animal's gaze and saw the flash of white in the reeds. His first thought was a stray sheep, or maybe a deer caught in the mud. He was a quiet man, made quieter by the war that had left a permanent shadow in his gray eyes. He didn't seek out trouble, but he didn't ride away from it either. He dismounted, his movements economical and sure, and approached on foot. The closer he got, the clearer the picture became. Not a sheep, a woman in what looked like a wedding dress, kneeling in the mud, her shoulders shaking. "Ma'am." His voice was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. Eliza flinched, scrambling to her feet. She faced him, her chin lifted in a gesture of defiance that her trembling body betrayed. Her hair had come loose from its pins, wild strands of dark chestnut framing a face pale with shock. Her eyes, the color of moss after a rain, were wide and haunted, and he could have sworn he smelled the faint, lingering scent of church incense. He stopped a dozen feet away, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace. He saw the torn lace, the mud-caked hem, and the dark line of blood welling on her palm. "You're hurt," he stated. It wasn't a question. "I'm fine," she said, her voice a raw whisper. She instinctively hid her bleeding hand in the folds of her skirt. Jonah's gaze flickered past her, up toward the town. He knew what day it was. The whole valley knew Sheriff Royce was getting married. He looked back at the woman before him, at the wreckage of her wedding day, and the pieces clicked into place with a grim, final certainty. He knew Clay Royce. He knew Burke Mallory. And he knew that whatever had happened in that church was about more than a simple change of heart. "You're on my land," he said. Not as an accusation, but as a fact. The sun will be down in an hour. It gets cold. Coyotes are getting bold this season. Eliza stared at him. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulder but lean, dressed in homespun and worn leather. His face was weathered, all hard angles and sun-etched lines, his dark hair a little too long. He wasn't handsome like Clay. There was nothing easy or charming about him. He looked like the land itself, unforgiving, steadfast, and carrying the memory of old wounds. "I can't go back to town," she said, the words tasting like ash. "I figured as much." Jonah replied. He took a slow step forward, pulling a clean kerchief from his pocket. He held it out. "For your hand." She hesitated for a long moment, her pride warring with the simple, undeniable fact of her pain. Finally, she took it. Her fingers brushed his, and his skin was calloused and warm. She wrapped the cloth around her palm, the clean white cotton quickly turning red. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his horse. He swung himself into the saddle, then looked down at her. "My place is just around the bend. It's warm. There's coffee." He paused. "It's safe." That one word, safe, was what decided it. Safety was a currency she no longer possessed. She gave a single, jerky nod. He reached a hand down to her, and she took it, allowing him to pull her up to sit in front of him on the saddle. Her ruined dress bunched up around her as Barak began a slow, steady walk. She was stiff, her back ramrod straight, careful not to lean against the stranger who was her only refuge. The ride was silent, broken only by the creak of leather and the soft sigh of the wind through the cottonwoods. His ranch was little more than a sturdy log cabin, a barn, and a web of corrals, all built with a craftsman's care. It was clean, orderly, and fiercely self-contained. Inside, the cabin was sparse but solid. A stone hearth, a table and 2 chairs, a bed built into the wall. It smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and pine. He motioned for her to sit at the table while he stoked the fire and put a pot of coffee on to boil. He brought her a basin of water and a bar of lye soap. As she washed the dirt and blood from her hand, the sting brought tears to her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. He worked silently, his back to her, laying out a tin plate with a piece of cornbread and jerky. He poured 2 mugs of coffee, black and strong, and set one in front of her. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the crackle of the fire. The setting sun cast long, orange fingers of light through the cabin's single window. "My father," she finally said, her voice low, "always said our name was all we truly had, that heartland. It was his pride." Jonah didn't look at her, but he nodded, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from his mug. "A good name is hard-earned in this valley." "Clay Royce and Burke Mallory have stolen mine," she whispered. "They'll say I'm ruined. They'll twist this until I'm the one at fault, a flighty, hysterical woman who couldn't see a good thing through." "They will," Jonah agreed, his voice flat. "Mallory doesn't leave loose ends, and a woman alone, with a disputed claim to the best water rights in the hollow, you won't be left in peace." The fear she'd been holding at bay began to seep into her bones, colder than the coming night. What could she do? May Romero, the kind woman who sold pies in town, would help. But her home was small and offered no real protection. The McBrides, their neighbors, were good people, but they were already struggling under the weight of Mallory's bank loans. There was nowhere to go. Jonah finally looked at her, his gray eyes direct and serious. "You can't go back. You can't stay on your father's claim alone. They'll find a way to run you off, legally or otherwise." He took a slow breath, as if weighing his next words with extreme care. "There's another way, a way that gives you cover." Eliza waited, her heart thudding a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. "You stay here," he said, "with me, in name only." Her breath hitched. She stared at him, uncomprehending. "What?" "It's a shield," he explained, his voice low and even, as if he were discussing crop rotation. "A woman living under the roof of a man she ain't married to is one thing, but a woman working as a housekeeper, earning her keep under a respectable roof, that's another. It gives the gossips a story they can chew on, but it keeps you protected. It puts my name, and my rifle, between you and Mallory's men. They'll hesitate to come onto another man's property to cause trouble." She felt a fresh wave of humiliation wash over her. To flee from being a bartered bride only to become a hired housekeeper, living under the charity and protection of a stranger, was this all a woman could ever be? An attachment to a man's name, a piece of his property. "I would be trading one cage for another." "This ain't a cage," Jonah said, his voice hardening slightly. "There's no lock on that door. It's a truce, a place to stand your ground while you figure out how to fight back. You can leave any time you want." He looked away, back toward the fire. "I was in the cavalry. I know how to hold a line." He was offering her a sanctuary, but it was a sanctuary forged from the same grim logic that had entrapped her. It was a man's world, and a woman needed a man's protection to survive in it. The wind howled outside, a lonely, desolate sound. From far off in the hills, a wolf answered it, the cabin, with its warm fire and the quiet, solid presence of the man across from her. felt like the only anchor in a world that had come loose from its moorings. She was Eliza Hart, her father's daughter, a woman whose name had been turned into a commodity, but she was still alive, and she would not be broken. She looked at Jonah Briggs, at the scars she could see on his knuckles and the deeper ones she could sense in his eyes. He was offering her shelter, not sentiment, a strategy, not a promise. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was better than the poison Clay and Mallory were serving. "All right," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but clear and steady. "For a time, I'll stay." He gave a single, sharp nod. The deal was struck. Outside, the last of the light bled from the sky, and the vast, cold darkness of the Wyoming night settled over Copper Hollow. The first morning at the Briggs Ranch dawned cold and clear. A sliver of pale light edged the mountains to the east, promising a day that would turn harsh and bright. Eliza woke in the small loft, a space tucked under the angled roof that Jonah had wordlessly indicated was hers. She hadn't slept. Not truly. She had drifted through a gray landscape of half-dreams filled with the echoes of a silent church and the sharp snag of barbed wire. She had been given a blanket, rough but clean, and the scent of dried lavender and cedar clung to it. A scent of a life lived simply and alone. Down below, a floorboard creaked. Jonah was already moving. By the time she had composed herself, smoothing her borrowed, oversized man's shirt over her petticoat, the only piece of her old life she still wore, the smell of coffee, was already rising to meet her. She descended the sturdy ladder to find him standing by the open cabin door, a tin mug in his hand, looking out at the sprawling valley as it slowly woke. He didn't seem to be a man who needed many words to fill the quiet. The fire was already built up in the hearth, a small pot of oatmeal simmering beside the coffee. He had laid out a second mug on the rough-hewn table, an unspoken invitation. "Morning," he said, his voice a low rumble that didn't disturb the stillness. He didn't turn to look at her. "Good morning," Eliza replied, her own voice softer than she intended. She poured herself a coffee, the bitter, smoky aroma a welcome shock to her senses. The first few days passed in this rhythm of shared silence and practical necessity. There was no pretense of a social visit. Theirs was an arrangement born of crisis, and it was defined by work. The day after her arrival, he led her out to the southern fence line. A section of posts had been loosened by the shifting, dry soil. "A fence is an argument," he told her, his hands testing the stability of a weathered cedar post. "You make your case with wire and sweat, and you hope the land and your neighbors respect it." She understood the unspoken part of his statement. Burke Mallory respected no arguments but his own. Eliza, who had spent her life with a needle and thread, learned to handle a post-hole digger. The work was brutal. The sun beat down, and the alkaline dust caked her skin and throat. But with every shovelful of earth she moved, with every staple she hammered into place, she felt a small, hard piece of her old self being buried and a tougher, more resilient version taking root. Jonah worked beside her, never offering a word of praise or complaint. He simply showed her how to brace her feet, how to use her weight to drive the digger down. In their shared labor, a silent understanding began to form. He wasn't treating her like a delicate, broken thing. He was treating her like a partner in a necessary task. In the evenings, the roles reversed. She took the small stores of flour, beans, and salted pork in his pantry and turned them into meals that were more than just fuel. She baked bread that filled the small cabin with a warm, comforting scent it had likely never known. One evening, she found his work shirt, the one he wore daily, with a tear at the elbow so frayed it was about to give way completely. She took out the small sewing kit she always carried, her last tangible connection to her trade, and with neat, precise stitches, she mended the fabric. He noticed when he came in from tending the horses. He picked up the shirt, running a calloused thumb over the tidy patch. He didn't say thank you. He just looked at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his gray eyes, and gave a short, single nod. It was enough. A week into her stay, a buckboard rattled up the path to the cabin. It was May Romero, her round, kind face shaded by a wide-brimmed hat. She brought a basket filled with fresh eggs, a sack of flour, and a jar of her famous peach preserves. "Figured you could use this more than I could," she said, her dark eyes taking in the scene, the sparse cabin. Eliza in her borrowed clothes with a glance that missed nothing. She pulled Eliza into a fierce, warm hug that smelled of cinnamon and yeast. "Child, I'm so sorry for what they did to you." Jonah offered May coffee, and the three of them sat at the table. The dam of silence broke. May was the valley's unofficial gazette. Her news gleaned from every rancher and townsfolk who bought her pies. The story in town, she reported, was exactly what Eliza had feared. Sheriff Royce was painting himself as the victim, a good man deceived by a woman of unstable character and grasping ambition. They were saying she had fled the church in a fit of hysterics and immediately taken up with Jonah Briggs, proving her fickle nature. "They're making you out to be a stain on the town's good name," May said, her lips tightening. "Clay is just Mallory's mouthpiece now. He does the bank's bidding and calls it keeping the peace. He's squeezing the McBrides something fierce, threatening to call in their loan before harvest unless they agree to sell their northern pasture, the one with the creek." Eliza's hands clenched in her lap. The McBrides were good people. She had made their youngest daughter's christening gown. And people believe him. "Some do," May admitted, her gaze softening with pity. "The ones who owe Mallory money. They believe whatever he tells them to. The others, they just keep their heads down. Nobody wants Mallory's eye turned on them." Before she left, May pressed a small, leather-bound ledger into Eliza's hand. "Your father's," she said quietly. "He left it with me for safekeeping before his last trip. Said it had a map of every spring and seep in this whole valley. Said water was life, and a map of it was a testament." That night, after May was gone, the cabin felt smaller, the silence more oppressive. Eliza opened the ledger. Inside, in her father's neat, careful hand, were intricate drawings of the Copper River and all its tributaries, with notes on flow rates, soil quality, and historical flood lines. It was a masterpiece of observation, the life's work of a man who loved and understood his land. She showed it to Jonah. He took the book with a reverence that surprised her, his fingers tracing the delicate lines of ink. "He knew," Jonah said, his voice low with respect. He knew where the valley's heart was. He unrolled a larger map of his own, a topographical survey of the territory. "This is the government's map," he said. "It shows property lines, but your father's map, this shows life." He laid the ledger open next to his survey. "Look here." He pointed to a spot on his ranch. "The survey says this is dry grazing land. Your father's map shows a deep spring aquifer, not 10 feet below the surface. That's why my well never runs dry, even in a drought." For the first time, he was teaching her, sharing a knowledge that was essential to his survival. He showed her how Mallory was buying up parcels that looked worthless on the official survey but were, according to her father's map, secretly rich in water. The railroad wasn't just coming for the land. It was coming for the water that controlled it. He was playing a long, cruel game, and Eliza and her small inheritance had been a key piece. "We have to bury the pipe tomorrow," Jonah said abruptly, rolling up his survey. "The clouds over the peaks are looking heavy. The spring melt could come early this year. If the river floods before we secure the intake, we'll lose our clean water for months." The next day, they dug a trench from the riverbank to the cistern near the cabin, laying a length of iron pipe to draw water from below the turbulent surface. The work was even harder than the fencing. A cold wind blew down from the mountains, carrying the first real scent of rain. As they worked, Eliza felt the weight of her choice to stay. Was she a help to this man, or a liability her presence had brought Mallory's attention directly to his doorstep? "You should let me go," she said that evening, as they cleaned the mud from their tools. "I'm putting you in danger. Jonah, this is my fight." He stopped, turning to face her fully in the fading light. "Mallory was coming for this land long before you were. Eliza," he said, using her first name for the first time. It sounded strange and resonant in the quiet air. "He's been coming for it since the day I filed my claim. You didn't bring the war here. You just gave it a face." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "I don't run from a fight." It wasn't a declaration of affection. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of character. And in that moment, Eliza felt the first tentative seed of trust in another person begin to sprout in the barren ground of her heart. This man would not abandon his post. That night, the quiet was broken by a sound that wasn't the wind or a coyote. It was the soft, rhythmic thud of a hammer driving something into the earth. Jonah was out of his bunk and had his rifle in hand before Eliza was even fully awake. He moved with a predator's silence, slipping out the cabin door and into the moon-drenched darkness. Eliza crept to the window, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She saw him melt into the shadows along the corral fence. A few moments later, two figures on horseback spurred their horses away from the riverbank, their forms quickly swallowed by the night. Jonah didn't come back inside for a long time. When he finally did, his face was set like granite. He didn't carry the rifle, but he held something else in his hand. He walked to the table and dropped it with a heavy thud. It was a wooden stake, about 2 feet long, sharpened to a crude point. The top 6 inches were painted a garish blood red. "They put 3 of them in," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Right on the riverbank, survey markers, Mallory survey." Eliza stared at the stake. It was such a simple, crude object, yet it felt more menacing than a loaded gun. It was an invasion, a claim staked in the dead of night. It was the physical embodiment of Burke Mallory's greed, hammered into the heart of Jonah's land. The red tip seemed to glow in the lamplight, a bloody promise of the fight to come. The time for mending fences was over. The argument had begun. The red stake sat on the mantelpiece of the hearth, a silent, bloody accusation. For 2 days, it was the first thing Eliza saw in the morning and the last thing she saw before the fire burned down to embers. It was a declaration of war, and war required a response. The summons for the monthly town council meeting, posted on the door of the general store, was the designated battlefield. "You don't have to go," Jonah said on the morning of the meeting. He was checking the cinch on Burak's saddle, his movements tight with a coiled anger. "This will be ugly. They'll aim their words at you." Eliza finished braiding her hair, her fingers pulling the strands into a tight, severe knot at the nape of her neck. She was wearing a simple, dark calico dress May had brought her, a garment of quiet respectability that felt like armor. "If my name is to be a weapon in this fight," she said, her voice even, "then I will be the one to wield it. I won't have Clay Royce or any other man speak for me." Jonah looked at her then, a long, assessing gaze. He saw not the frightened woman he had found by the river, but a person gathering their strength, piece by painful piece. He gave a curt nod. "Get your shawl. The wind's picking up." The Copper Hollow Meeting Hall was also the schoolhouse and, on Sundays, an overflow chapel. It smelled of chalk dust, unwashed bodies, and the simmering stew of civic anxiety. When Jonah and Eliza entered, conversation dwindled to a series of hushed, pointed whispers. Every eye was on them. She saw pity in some faces, contempt in others, and in most, a fearful curiosity. She kept her chin high and her gaze fixed forward as they took 2 seats at the back. Sheriff Clay Royce stood at the front, looking smug and authoritative. Beside him, seated as if on a throne, was Burke Mallory, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the homespun and denim of the ranchers and miners. The meeting began with trivialities, a dispute over a stray bull, the cost of lumber for a new town well. Then Mallory stood up. A calculated hush fell over the room. "Friends, neighbors," he began, his voice smooth as polished river stone. "I stand before you today not as a banker, but as a partner in prosperity." He spoke of the future, a gleaming vision of progress brought by the railroad. He painted a picture of their crops and cattle reaching markets in the east, of new goods and new opportunities flowing into their valley. "The Mallory Rail and Bank is not just laying track," he boomed. "We are laying the foundation for a new era of civilization in this wild country." He gestured to a large map pinned to the wall, where a bold, black line sliced through the valley, cutting directly across the parcels owned by Jonah, the McBrides, and Eliza's late father. "To achieve this great work," Mallory continued, his tone turning regretful, "some small sacrifices are necessary for the greater good. The law provides for this. It is a concept known as eminent domain. The needs of the many, the needs of progress, outweigh the stubborn desires of the few." A nervous murmur went through the crowd. This was no longer about abstract prosperity. It was about their land. "I have made generous offers to all landowners along the proposed route," Mallory said, his eyes sweeping the room before landing on Jonah. "Most are patriots who see the wisdom in this course. A few, however, stand in the way. Mr. Briggs, for example." Every head turned toward Jonah. He didn't rise. He simply sat, his presence as solid and unmovable as the mountains outside. "My land is not for sale," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. Mallory smiled, a cold, predatory expression. "Your personal feelings are noted, Mr. Briggs, but they do not supersede the law or the needs of this community." "What you call law," Jonah countered, "is just your greed written on paper. You want the land for the water underneath it. We all know it." Before Mallory could reply, Clay Royce stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "That's enough. Briggs, these are official proceedings. We'll have no wild accusations." He then turned his gaze, full of venomous spite, directly on Eliza. "Perhaps Mr. Briggs's judgment is being clouded by his current company. Some people have a talent for latching onto property that isn't theirs." The insult, so public and so vile, hung in the stifling air. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of judgment. This was the moment Eliza had dreaded, the public shaming she knew they had planned. She felt Jonah tense beside her, ready to rise, but she placed a hand on his arm, a silent plea. This was her fight. Slowly, she stood up. The whispering stopped. The silence was absolute. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she met Clay's sneer with a cold, steady gaze. "Mr. Mallory speaks of building a future," she said, her voice trembling at first, then gaining strength with every word. "He speaks of prosperity. But I ask you, the people of this valley, what kind of future is built on a foundation of lies?" She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of her neighbors. A lie told in a church to steal a man's legacy. A lie told to a town to steal its most precious resource. You cannot build a strong house on rotten timber, and you cannot build a prosperous community on deceit. She turned her eyes back to Mallory. "Your railroad may bring money, sir, but it will not bring honor. Stop hiding behind pretty words and false laws. If you want our land, have the courage to admit you are a thief, not a visionary." The room was stunned into silence. A woman, a ruined woman, had spoken out with such force and clarity. Then Clay Royce laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Honor," he scoffed, his face red with fury. "You dare speak of honor? This is the woman who left her groom at the altar, a woman who clearly had a better offer waiting in the wings." He pointed a finger at her. "Don't be fooled by her pretty words. This isn't about honor, it's about money. She believes that by aligning with Briggs, she can squeeze a higher price out of the railroad for her father's land. She is no better than he is a greedy obstructionist, standing in the way of all of you." The spell was broken. The room erupted into a cacophony of shouts and arguments. Men who owed the bank shouted their support for Mallory. A few of the older ranchers grumbled their agreement with Jonah. It was chaos. Amid the turmoil, the council chairman, a man firmly in Mallory's pocket, banged his gavel and declared the matter of the railroad survey approved. Jonah stood up, his face a thunderous mask. He took Eliza's arm and steered her through the angry, divided crowd and out into the afternoon air. The ride back to the ranch was thick with unspoken words. The sky, which had been a clear, hard blue, was now bruised with shades of gray and a sickly yellow-green along the western horizon. The wind had picked up, no longer a breeze but a constant, violent force that whipped dust and grit into their faces and made the horses skittish. They were halfway home, riding through the wide-open basin where the river made a great, slow bend, when the world dissolved. A low roar grew from the west, and the horizon vanished behind a churning, roiling wall of brown. "Sandstorm!" Jonah yelled over the wind. "Get down! Cover your face!" He pulled her from her horse, pushing her down into the relative shelter of a shallow ravine. The storm hit them like a physical blow. The sun disappeared. The air turned thick and choking, a blinding whirlwind of sand and soil that stung their skin and filled their mouths and eyes. The roar was deafening, a freight train of wind that threatened to tear them from the earth. They huddled together, Jonah's body shielding hers from the worst of the blast. As the world was scoured clean, it passed as quickly as it had come. One moment, they were in a maelstrom, the next, the roaring faded, and a strange, heavy silence fell. A weak, filtered light returned. They were coated in a fine layer of dust, their faces caked with mud. But the landscape was transformed. The wind had reshaped the very ground they stood on, and the river, the low, placid Copper River, was now a churning, muddy torrent, swollen with a flash flood from a cloudburst farther up in the mountains. The storm had dumped its rain in the high country, and now the valley was paying the price. And in the middle of the rising water, trapped on a rapidly shrinking sandbar, was a small group of cattle. Eliza recognized the brand, the McBrides. "They'll be swept away," she gasped. "Not if we can help it," Jonah said, already moving. "The bank on this side is steep but solid. If we can push them across, they might make it." There was no time to think. They spurred their horses into the shallows, the powerful animals struggling against the surprisingly strong current. The cattle were panicked, lowing in terror as the muddy water swirled around their legs. Jonah, with a lifetime of experience, knew how to move them. He used his horse to press them from one side while Eliza, following his lead, worked from the other. They were a team, moving without words, driven by the same desperate urgency. They managed to push the last of the terrified animals up the steep, muddy bank. Eliza was guiding a young calf, her horse slipping on the slick mud. When she felt the ground beneath her give way, the riverbank, saturated and unstable, crumbled. With a cry, she was pitched from her saddle and into the raging water. The cold was a violent shock, stealing her breath. The current seized her, tumbling her over and over in a disorienting world of brown water and debris. She fought to surface, her lungs screaming for air, but the weight of her waterlogged skirts pulled her down. Panic, cold and absolute, threatened to consume her. Then, through the murky chaos, a hand, strong, rough, and unwavering, Jonah, leaning precariously from his saddle, his arm outstretched, had lunged for her. His fingers clamped around her wrist with bruising force. He held on. The current tore at her, trying to pull her away, but his grip was like iron. With a great raw cry of effort, he hauled her upward, pulling her from the river's grasp and dragging her half across his saddle. She lay there, gasping, coughing up muddy water, her heart pounding with a wild, terrifying rhythm. They had survived. He had saved her. They reached the solid ground of his ranch as dusk settled, leaving a world washed clean and utterly changed. They were soaked, shivering, and exhausted to the bone. Inside the cabin, by the warmth of a roaring fire, the adrenaline faded, leaving a profound quiet in its wake. The trial in the town hall had been a battle of words. The trial by storm had been a battle for their very lives. And in that battle, a new clarity had been forged. Eliza looked at Jonah, who was staring into the flames, his profile etched by the firelight. He had not just offered her shelter. He had anchored her in the storm. "They won't stop," she said, her voice hoarse. "Mallory and Clay, they will twist the law, and when that fails, they will use force." "I know," Jonah said. "Then we can't just stand our ground anymore," she continued, a new, hard resolve in her voice. "We can't wait for them to act. We have to fight back, not just for us, but for the McBrides, and for everyone else they're trying to crush." Jonah turned from the fire to look at her. The last of his reservations were gone, washed away by the flood. He saw not a liability, but an ally, a partner. "You're right," he said. "Standing our ground isn't enough. We need evidence. We need witnesses." A plan began to form in the warm, quiet space between them. A plan built not on a handshake, but on a hand clasp that had pulled her from the depths. "May will help," Eliza said. "And Levi Turner. He's the one who exposed Clay in the first place. He isn't afraid of them." Jonah nodded, his eyes meeting hers across the hearth. "Tomorrow," he said, "we start gathering our own army." The decision made in the quiet aftermath of the storm became a frantic, whispered campaign in the days that followed. There was no longer time for silent labor and unspoken understandings. The red stake on Jonah's mantle was a clock, and its hands were moving toward a deadline they couldn't see. Their strategy needed roots, and Eliza knew those roots had to be sunk in the soil of shared grievance. She began with the McBrides. She rode Jonah's gentlest mare, the one he called Quietude, and found Samuel McBride reinforcing the very section of Riverbank that had nearly claimed her. His wife, Martha, stood nearby, her face a mask of weary resolve, a bucket in each hand. The cattle they had saved were safe in the high pasture, but the fear remained, clinging to the air like the damp chill from the flood. Eliza dismounted, foregoing pleasantries. "Samuel, Martha, I need your help." Samuel McBride stopped his work, leaning his shovel against a newly placed boulder. He was a good man, but a tired one. His shoulders stooped from the constant fight against drought, debt, and now a predatory bank. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice heavy, "we're grateful for what you and Briggs did for our stock, but we can't afford any more trouble. Mallory's man, Harmon Pike, was by yesterday. Said the bank was reevaluating our loan terms. It was a threat, plain and simple." "That's why I'm here," Eliza said, her voice low and urgent. "He's doing the same to everyone. He is breaking us one by one. But if we stand together, if we can present a case to a judge outside of this valley, a judge Mallory doesn't own, we might have a chance." She held out a sheaf of clean paper and a small bottle of ink. "I need your story. Samuel, I need you to write down every threat Pike has made, every time the bank has changed your terms without cause. Swear to it. It's called an affidavit, a sworn statement. Alone, it is just a complaint. But together, with others, they become a chorus of truth." Martha McBride set her buckets down. "And what if we do? What if Mallory finds out he'll take everything, our home?" "He is taking it anyway," Eliza countered, her gaze unflinching. "He is just doing it slowly, with papers and laws he's twisted to his purpose. At least this way. We fight. We make our stand on paper, with the truth as our weapon, before he forces us to make it with nothing but our bare hands." Samuel looked at his wife, at the raw, calloused skin of his own hands. And then back at Eliza. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had faced down Clay Royce in the meeting hall. He saw a woman who had lost everything and had decided to fight with what little she had left. He took the paper. "Martha," he said, "fetch me the good pen." That small victory gave her the strength to continue. Her next stop was the small cabin of the widow Tolbert, a woman whose husband had died in a mining accident 6 months prior. Mallory had offered her a pittance for her land the day after the funeral, citing her inability as a woman to manage a claim. Eliza sat with her at her kitchen table, listening to the quiet, dignified pain in her voice. She left with a second sworn statement. Her most difficult journey was to the small, makeshift camp of Navajo miners at the northern edge of the valley. They had a traditional claim to a small creek, one that predated any of the settlers' deeds. But Mallory's surveyors had begun rerouting the water, choking their small enterprise to a trickle. They were distrustful, having learned from bitter experience that the white man's promises were as fleeting as the summer rain. Eliza didn't approach them with talk of laws and courts. She brought her father's leather-bound ledger. She sat with their elder, a man named Hoskin, whose face was a beautiful, intricate map of a long and difficult life, and she opened the book. She showed him her father's careful drawings of the streams and springs, a testament from one man who respected the land to another. She spoke not as a landowner, but as the daughter of a man who understood that water was sacred. She told them that the man who was stealing their water was the same man who had tried to steal her name and her land. They were all downstream from the same poison. Hoskin listened, his dark eyes studying her face. He took the ledger, his fingers tracing the inked lines with a gentle reverence. When he spoke, it was in a mix of his own tongue and sparse, precise English. He told her his own story, one of broken treaties and stolen resources. He would not sign her paper. He said the white man's court had never been a friend to his people, but he would bear witness. If the time came, he would speak the truth of the water. It was a promise more binding than any signature. With a small but growing collection of affidavits, the time came to gather their forces. The meeting was held in Jonah's old, disused barn. It was a cavernous, timber-framed structure that smelled of dust, old hay, and the ghosts of harvests past. They came after dark, one by one, their faces anxious in the flickering light of a dozen carefully hung lanterns. The McBrides were there, as was Widow Tolbert. May Romero arrived with a basket of fresh bread, her presence a warm, calming influence. And finally, Levi Turner, the former sheriff, his face grim, his back as straight as it had been when he wore a badge. Jonah had nailed his large survey map to the barn's back wall. As each family's story was told, Eliza took a simple sewing pin with a head of red wax and pushed it into their parcel on the map. First the McBride's pasture, then Widow Tolbert's claim, then her own father's land, and Jonah's ranch that sat beside it like a fortress. Soon, a constellation of red dots emerged, forming a clear, undeniable path along the valley's water sources. It was Mallory's battle plan, laid bare for all to see. "He's creating a stranglehold," Levi said, his voice a low growl. "He controls the water. He controls everything. He's not just building a railroad, he's building a kingdom." Fear was a palpable thing in the lantern-lit barn. Samuel McBride voiced what everyone was thinking. "We signed these papers, and what's to stop him from ruining us before we ever see a judge? He has the sheriff in his pocket. He has the bank. We have nothing." "You have this," Levi said, tapping the stack of sworn statements Eliza had collected. "You have the truth, and you have each other." He explained the plan. They would not file a complaint in Copper Hollow, where Mallory could crush it. They would take a collective petition, a legal injunction supported by every affidavit, directly to the district court in Helena. "It's a 100-mile ride, and it's risky," Levi admitted. "But the judge there, Judge Abramson, he's an old-timer. He doesn't like being told what to do, especially not by big city money. Jonah stepped forward, his quiet presence commanding the room. "I'll ride to Helena," he said. "I'll take the petition." "No," Eliza said, her voice clear and strong. "We will ride to Helena. This began with my name, and I will see it through to the end." A sense of fragile, defiant hope settled over the small group. They were no longer isolated victims. They were a coalition. They agreed. At the end of the week, Jonah and Eliza would ride for Helena. They left the barn that night with a renewed sense of purpose, their footsteps lighter than when they had arrived. Eliza and Jonah stood for a moment outside the cabin, watching the last of their allies disappear into the darkness. The air was cool and still. For the first time in weeks, a sliver of peace seemed possible. That peace was shattered just before dawn by the frantic, terrified barking of Jonah's dog. Jonah was awake instantly, a soldier's instinct pulling him from sleep. Eliza was right behind him. The first thing they saw was the light. An unnatural, hungry orange glow flickered against the eastern sky, in the direction of the McBride Ranch. And then came the smell on the wind, the unmistakable, sickening scent of burning pine and terror. The barn. Jonah breathed, his voice a raw curse. He didn't wait for another word. He was already sprinting toward his corral, throwing a saddle on Barack with a speed that was terrifying in its efficiency. Eliza was frozen for a heartbeat, a cold, sick knot of guilt twisting in her stomach. "I did this," a voice screamed in her head. "I convinced them to fight, and now this is their reward." She shook off the paralysis and ran for quietude. By the time they reached the McBride place, the barn was a roaring inferno, a tower of flame that clawed at the black sky, spitting embers that danced like malevolent fireflies. The entire structure was engulfed. The heat was a physical blow, driving them back. Samuel was desperately trying to keep the flames from spreading to his house, beating at the dry grass with a wet blanket, while Martha herded their crying children. Then they heard a high, piercing scream from within the inferno. Not human. It was the sound of a horse, trapped and terrified. "The mare!" Martha McBride shrieked, her face a mess of tears and soot. "She just foaled yesterday. We couldn't get them out." Before Eliza could even scream a warning, Jonah had leaped from Barack. He grabbed a horse blanket from a nearby trough, soaked it with water, and wrapped it around his head and shoulders. "Jonah, no!" she cried. But he was already gone, a fleeting shadow that disappeared into the blazing doorway of the barn. The seconds that followed were an eternity. The roar of the fire was punctuated by the groaning of collapsing timbers. Eliza could only watch, her hand clapped over her mouth, her heart seizing in her chest. It was impossible. No one could survive that. Then, a shape stumbled out of the smoke. It was Jonah. He was half carrying, half guiding the panicked mare, who was wild-eyed with terror. And nestled against his chest, wrapped in the charred remains of his shirt, was a tiny, trembling foal, its legs barely able to hold it. He had just cleared the entrance when a massive, burning crossbeam crashed down exactly where he had been standing. He managed to push the mare and foal to safety before he collapsed to his knees. Gasping for air, the left sleeve of his shirt was gone, and the skin of his forearm was a raw, angry red. The flesh blistered and seared. The valley came alive. The light of the fire was a beacon, and soon neighbors arrived, forming a bucket brigade from the creek, their faces grim and set. They saved the house, but the barn was a total loss, a blackened, skeletal ruin smoldering against the rising sun. There was no need for discussion. Everyone knew who was responsible: Harmon Pike. This was Mallory's answer to their secret meeting. It was a message, written in fire and ash. The war was no longer one of words and paper. Later, back at the cabin, Eliza carefully cleaned and bandaged Jonah's arm. He bore the pain with a stoic silence that was more unnerving than any cry. The burn was severe, a permanent brand of the night's violence. "This is my fault," she whispered, her hands trembling as she tied off the bandage. "I brought this upon them. I pushed them." Jonah finally looked at her, his gray eyes clear despite the pain. "Harmon Pike was always one of Mallory's weapons," he said, his voice raspy from the smoke. "Fire was always in his arsenal. You didn't give him the match. Eliza, you just gave the McBrides the courage to stand up before he decided to burn them down for no reason at all." His words offered little comfort. The weight of her responsibility felt immense, just as despair threatened to overwhelm her. A knock came at the door. It was the McBride's eldest boy, his face smudged with soot. He didn't say a word, just thrust a folded, dirty piece of paper into Eliza's hand and ran off. She unfolded it. It was a single page torn from a ledger, the handwriting unfamiliar. There was no signature. It was just a list of expenses, written in a clerk's neat hand. The last entry made her blood run cold. It read H. Pike, $50. Services rendered, barn raising. It was a piece of paper, a quiet, anonymous little thing. But in the ashes of the McBride's barn, it was a spark. It was hard evidence. It was a weapon, and it pointed directly to the heart of the enemy. The day before they were to leave for Helena was unnervingly quiet. The frantic energy of collecting affidavits and the raw, violent shock of the fire had subsided, leaving a heavy, expectant stillness in their wake. The anonymous note, that single sheet of damning evidence, was wrapped in oilcloth and tucked safely in Jonah's saddlebag, a sleeping serpent waiting to strike. The valley seemed to be holding its breath. Eliza spent the morning turning the cabin into a fortress of readiness. She baked hardtack biscuits, packed salted pork and dried beans, and inspected the seams on their heavy wool coats. Every small, practical task was a prayer against the chaos to come. She changed the bandage on Jonah's arm, her touch light and practiced. The burn was healing, the raw red flesh slowly giving way to new, tender skin. A scar would remain, a permanent, silvered map of his courage, and she found she could not look at it without a painful tightening in her chest. He sat stoically through her ministrations, his jaw tight. The fire had burned away the last of his carefully constructed distance. In the shared trauma of that night, and in the quiet, focused work that followed, the pretense of their arrangement, housekeeper and employer, had been reduced to ash. They were two people bound together by a common threat, a shared purpose. Yet, a new tension had grown in its place, a quiet awareness that hummed in the small space between them whenever their hands brushed or their eyes met for a moment too long. As the afternoon sun began its long descent, casting the western peaks in sharp, dramatic relief, a familiar restlessness took hold of Eliza. It was a feeling she had come to know intimately over the past weeks, a pull toward the river. It was more than a habit. It was a pilgrimage. The riverbank was where her old life had ended in a tangle of torn lace and barbed wire, and where this new, uncertain life had begun with the appearance of a quiet stranger on a buckskin horse. "I'm going for a walk," she said, her voice soft in the quiet cabin. Jonah looked up from the harness buckle he was mending. He didn't ask where. He knew. He simply nodded, his gray eyes following her as she took her shawl from its peg by the door. The air outside was cool and carried the clean, sharp scent of pine from the high country. The world was awash in the golden, syrupy light of late afternoon. Eliza walked the familiar path, her footsteps muffled by the dry grass. She passed the sturdy fence line they had repaired together, the newly laid water pipe that now ran securely from the river to the cistern. These were the small monuments to their burgeoning partnership, tangible proof that they could build and mend as well as fight. She came to the spot, a high, grassy bank overlooking a wide, placid bend in the Copper River. The water, now calm and clear after the flood, reflected the brilliant, painted sky. She stood there, wrapping the shawl tighter around her shoulders, and watched as the sun began to bleed its colors along the horizon, streaks of fiery orange, deep rose, and soft, bruised purple. In the first days of her flight, she had come here seeking, she wasn't sure what, a sign, perhaps, a moment of clarity, a confirmation that she had done the right thing by running. She had stood on this bank and watched the sun set on a life that was supposed to have been hers, and she had felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. The sunset had been a beautiful, painful reminder of an ending. Every evening, she had waited for it, as if its final, fleeting blaze of glory could somehow cauterize the wound inside her. Now, as she stood watching the familiar spectacle, her thoughts were different. They were not of the past, but of the precipice on which she now stood. Tomorrow, they would ride into the heart of the enemy's territory. They carried with them the fragile hopes of the entire valley, the McBrides, who were rebuilding their lives from the ashes, the widow Tolbert, who deserved to live on her land in peace, the Navajo, who deserved the simple justice of the water that was theirs. The weight of it felt immense, a physical pressure on her chest. She had asked these people for their trust. She had looked them in the eye and promised them a fighting chance. And in doing so, she had painted a target on all of them. And most especially on the man who had given her sanctuary. The burn on his arm was a constant, searing reminder of the cost of this fight. Was her newfound courage just another name for reckless pride? A soft footfall on the grass behind her made her turn. It was Jonah. He had approached so quietly she hadn't heard him until he was only a few yards away. He stopped, giving her space, his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn jacket. He wasn't looking at her, but out at the river, at the sky that was now a riot of impossible color. "You come here every evening?" He said. It wasn't a question. She gave a small, wry smile. "Does the new housekeeper not have permission to watch the sunset?" A faint upward twitch at the corner of his mouth was his only reply. They stood in comfortable silence for a long moment, watching as a hawk circled high above on an updraft. "When I first came here," she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper, "I felt like my life had been burned to the ground, like that barn. There was nothing left but smoke and ash." She looked out at the blazing horizon. "I'd stand here and watch the sun go down, and I'd think of it as a kind of funeral. The end of another day I had somehow managed to survive. I was waiting, I think, for the world to tell me what to do next." He turned his head to look at her then. The dying light softened the hard lines of his face, revealing a deep well of empathy in his eyes that he so carefully kept hidden. "And did it?" he asked. She shook her head, a slow, sad movement. "No. The world is quiet. It doesn't offer instructions. It just is harsh and beautiful and unforgiving." She paused, then met his gaze directly. "The world didn't change. I did, or rather," she corrected herself. "You did. You gave me a place to stand. You taught me that a fence is an argument. You showed me that a map can be a weapon. You pulled me from the river." The intensity of her gaze made him look away, a faint flush rising on his weathered cheeks. He was a man more comfortable with action than with words of gratitude. He gestured vaguely toward the spectacular display in the sky. "It's a fine sunset." "Yes," she agreed softly. "It is." He saw the lingering shadow of fear in her eyes, the weight she was carrying for all of them. He saw the woman who had faced down a roomful of hostile men, who had walked into camps of strangers to plead her case, who tended his wound with a gentleness that undid him, the carefully constructed walls he had built around his heart after the war, the ones meant to keep out pain and attachment, suddenly felt like a prison. He took a step closer, his presence a solid, reassuring warmth in the cooling air. A small, wry smile touched his lips, a genuine expression so rare it was startling. "You don't have to wait for it anymore," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "The sign you were looking for." She looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" He reached out, not to touch her, but to gesture from her, to himself, to the ranch nestled in the curve of the river behind them. He looked from the last brilliant sliver of the sun to her face, his eyes full of a meaning that made her breath catch in her throat. I'm your sunset now." The words were so unexpected, so simple, yet they landed with the force of a revelation. He wasn't just offering her shelter. He was offering her an ending, the end of the waiting, the end of the fear, the end of the loneliness. He was the closing of that chapter of her life. He was the beautiful, fiery, certain thing that marked the end of her day of survival and the beginning of a night of peace. A tear she hadn't realized she was holding back slipped down her cheek, and then she was moving, closing the small distance between them. His arms came around her, hesitant at first, then with a certainty that was both a shield and a sanctuary. She buried her face in the rough fabric of his jacket, which smelled of wood smoke, leather, and him. She wrapped her arms around his waist and held on, feeling the solid, steady beat of his heart against her cheek. It was the surest rhythm she had ever known. All the tension, all the fear, all the unspoken words of the past days seemed to melt away in the solid strength of his embrace. They stood like that for a long time, two solitary figures against the fading glory of the sky, until the brilliant colors softened into the deep, velvety blues of twilight. When Eliza finally leaned back to look up at him, she saw that the walls in his eyes were gone. There was only an open, vulnerable tenderness that mirrored her own. It was a choice made in the sudden, quiet clarity of the twilight. This was not a plea for shelter. It was a pledge of allegiance. This was not the act of a dependent woman seeking a protector. It was the act of an equal, a partner, sealing the unspoken pact between them. She rose on her toes and kissed him. It was a soft, tentative kiss at first, a question asked without words. She felt a tremor of surprise run through him before he responded, his lips meeting hers with a gentle pressure that spoke of a deep, contained hunger. The kiss was not frantic or desperate. It was imbued with the quiet, steadfast certainty of the land around them. It tasted of dust and coffee and the clean, cold air of the coming night. It was a promise of shared dawns, of arguments made with fences, of battles fought side by side. When they finally broke apart, the last light had faded from the sky, and the first stars were beginning to appear, sharp and brilliant in the clear, dark air. A new understanding, profound and unspoken, had settled between them. The lines of their arrangement had been redrawn, not on paper, but in the language of trust and mutual respect. They walked back to the cabin in a comfortable silence, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. The small flame of the lantern he had left burning on the table cast a warm, welcoming glow. "Helena," he said, his voice low as he barred the door. "It's more than the land now, isn't it?" "Yes," she replied, meeting his gaze across the small room. "It's everything. It's for the McBride's barn. It's for the lie they told in the church. We're not just going there to ask for protection. We're going there to demand justice. We have to expose all of it. Jonah, the whole rotten foundation." He nodded, the last of the evening's light glinting in his serious eyes. "We will," he said. It wasn't a boast. It was a vow. That night, she lay in her loft, listening to the quiet sounds of the cabin, to the steady breathing of the man below. She was no longer a woman waiting for a sign. The sun had set on that life, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that tomorrow they would ride east to meet the dawn, together. Helena was a city of brick and ambition. After the raw, wind-scoured plains of the Wyoming-Montana border, its wide, bustling streets, two-story buildings, and the distant, clangorous sound of a true rail yard felt like a different world. It was a world of established law and commerce, a place where justice was meant to be weighed on brass scales, not settled by the silent threat of a red survey stake. Yet, as Eliza and Jonah walked up the broad stone steps of the federal district courthouse, the air of civilization felt as thin and fragile as a pane of glass. The courtroom was paneled in dark, polished wood that gleamed in the light from the tall, arched windows. It smelled of floor wax, old paper, and the faint, acidic scent of men's sweat. At the front, an immense, carved bench sat empty, a throne of judgment waiting for its king. Jonah and Eliza took their seats behind a short, balding man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a slightly rumpled suit, Mr. Gable, the lawyer Levi Turner had insisted they hire. He had a quiet, methodical air, but his eyes were sharp, and he had listened to their story with an intensity that gave them a sliver of hope. On the other side of the aisle sat the enemy. Burke Mallory looked perfectly at home, his expensive suit immaculate, a gold watch chain glinting on his waistcoat. Beside him was his lawyer, a man named Sterling, whose slicked-back hair and condescending smirk seemed to be a uniform for his profession. Sheriff Clay Royce was not present. As the legal authority in Copper Hollow, his presence would have been a conflict, but his shadow loomed large over the proceedings. Then, Judge Abramson entered. He was a man carved from granite, with a thick mane of white hair, a formidable scowl, and eyes that looked as if they had seen every form of human folly and were impressed by none of it. When he sat, the room fell into a profound silence, broken only by the rustle of paper. The proceedings began. Mallory's lawyer, Sterling, rose to speak. His voice was a smooth, confident baritone that filled the courtroom, painting a glorious picture of progress. He unfurled a series of beautiful, professionally drafted maps, showcasing the proposed route of the Mallory rail line. He spoke of economic boons, of connecting the rugged territory to the civilized world, of manifest destiny rendered in iron and steam. "This is not merely a railroad, Your Honor," Sterling declared, his hand sweeping across the map. "It is a lifeline, a triumph of American ingenuity and spirit. And the law, in its wisdom, provides for such triumphs through the doctrine of eminent domain, ensuring that the private interests of a few cannot obstruct the public good of the many." He portrayed Jonah, the McBrides, and the other landowners as stubborn, backward-thinking homesteaders, clinging to the past and unable to see the magnificent future being offered to them. "We have made offers that are more than fair, more than generous," he said with a sigh of theatrical exasperation. "But some men, Your Honor, would rather be kings of their own dirt patches than citizens of a great and growing nation." It was a masterful performance, full of patriotic fervor and legal jargon, designed to make their opposition seem petty and selfish. Eliza felt a knot of despair tighten in her stomach. How could their collection of handwritten, tear-stained stories compete with this slick, confident vision of the future? Then it was Mr. Gable's turn. He rose, adjusted his spectacles, and his approach could not have been more different. He spoke in a plain, unadorned voice, without flourish or theatrics. "Your Honor," he began, "Mr. Sterling speaks of the future. I would like to speak about the present, and to do so, I would like to present to the court a series of sworn affidavits from the citizens of Copper Hollow." He started with Samuel McBride's statement. He read aloud Samuel's account of Harmon Pike's visits, the threats to call in his loan, the constant grinding pressure to sell the pasture that was the lifeblood of his ranch. Sterling was on his feet in an instant. "Objection, hearsay. This is a civil matter of land appropriation, not a forum for every disgruntled debtor's personal grievances." "Overruled," Judge Abramson grunted, his eyes fixed on Gable. "I'll hear it. Get on with it." "Counselor," Gable continued, his voice the only sound in the rapt courtroom. He read the widow Tolbert's statement about Mallory trying to buy her claim the day after her husband was buried. He read the accounts of 2 other ranchers who had been squeezed by the bank, their water rights mysteriously drying up after Mallory's surveyors had passed through. He was not telling a story of progress. He was telling a story of methodical, predatory conquest, a story of a community being systematically dismantled. When he finished, a heavy silence hung in the room. The grand vision Sterling had painted now seemed tarnished, the gleaming rails resting on a bed of human misery. "These stories are compelling. Mr. Gable," the judge said, his voice a low rumble. "But they do not, in themselves, prove illegality. Mr. Mallory is a banker. It is a banker's business to be persuasive." "I understand, Your Honor," Gable said, "which brings me to my next piece of evidence." He produced the copy of the anonymous note. This is a page torn from a private ledger, detailing a payment of $50 made to one Harmon Pike. The notation beside it reads, "Services rendered, barn raising." Sterling laughed out loud, a short, barking sound of contempt. "Your Honor, this is absurd. An anonymous, unsigned scrap of paper. It could have been written by anyone. For all we know, Mr. Briggs wrote it himself. It is without provenance and is utterly inadmissible." "The timing of this barn raising is curious, is it not?" Gable countered. "It is dated the very night that the McBride family's barn was burned to the ground." "Coincidence and innuendo," Sterling shot back. "This is a desperate, pathetic attempt to slander a respected businessman." Judge Abramson leaned forward. His eyes narrowed. "Mr. Gable, this is thin ice. Can you substantiate this document in any way?" Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the moment. She felt Jonah's hand, resting on the bench beside her, clench into a fist. Their entire case balanced on this single, fragile point. "I can, Your Honor, Mr. Gable said, his voice steady. "I would like to call a witness. The defense calls Miss Ellen Beck to the stand." The name dropped into the courtroom like a stone in a silent pool. From the back of the room, a small, plainly dressed woman with frightened, bird-like eyes began to walk forward. Eliza watched her, sending every ounce of her own hard-won courage across the space between them. She remembered her secret meeting with Ellen, arranged by May in the back room of a Helena boarding house. She remembered the woman's trembling hands, her terror of what Mallory would do, and the spark of defiant conscience that had, in the end, won out. Burke Mallory's reaction was instantaneous, his mask of calm. Civilized authority shattered. His face went slack with shock, then contorted in a mask of pure fury. He turned and hissed something at Sterling, who looked equally stunned. They had been utterly blindsided. Ellen Beck took the stand, her hand trembling as she was sworn in. She sat, clutching her hands in her lap, her gaze fixed on Mr. Gable as if he were a lifeline. "Miss Beck," Gable began gently, "would you please state your former occupation?" I was a clerk," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "For Mr. Mallory, at the Copper Hollow branch of his bank." "And can you identify the document I am holding?" Gable asked, holding up the anonymous note. Ellen squinted at it. "Yes, sir, that is a page from my daily ledger." "And the handwriting." "It's mine." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Sterling leaped to his feet. "Objection! This woman is a disgruntled former employee, no doubt fired for incompetence." "Were you fired?" Miss Beck Gable asked calmly. "No, sir," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I quit. I could no longer participate in what was happening." "Sit down. Mr. Sterling," the judge commanded, his eyes boring into Ellen. "Let the woman speak." Gable gestured to the last line on the page. "Miss Beck, can you explain this entry barn raising? Was Mr. Pike in the business of constructing barns?" Ellen took a shaky breath. "No, sir. Barn raising. That was Mr. Mallory's term. His little joke. It was what he called it when he sent Mr. Pike to persuade someone who wasn't cooperating. It meant setting a fire." The courtroom erupted. The judge hammered his gavel, his face a thunderous scowl. "Order, order. Or I will clear this room when silence was restored." He looked back at Ellen. "Miss Beck, this is a very serious accusation. Do you have any other evidence to support this claim?" This was the second blow. "Yes, Your Honor. She said Mr. Mallory's scheme was very thorough. He often spoke of how Sheriff Royce was a key asset. "Objection," Sterling roared. "Slander." Overruled, the judge thundered back. "Continue, Miss Beck." "The sheriff," Ellen said, her eyes fixed on a point on the far wall, as if she couldn't bear to look at anyone. "He provided Mr. Mallory with lists. He called them soft targets. A list of all the ranchers and claim holders who were behind on their payments, who had sick family, who were vulnerable. So Mr. Mallory would know exactly who to squeeze first, and how hard. The revelation was stunning. The town's chief lawman was acting as a wolf, pointing out the weakest sheep in the flock for his master. The conspiracy was no longer an insinuation. It was a sworn fact. But Ellen Beck was not finished. This was the final, fatal thrust of the knife. "There is one more thing, Your Honor," she said, her voice now clear and steady. The voice of a woman who had crossed her personal Rubicon and had nothing left to lose. Mr. Mallory was a man who hated to lose money. He always protected his investments. From the folds of her dress, she produced another document. "This is a copy of an insurance policy. It was taken out by Mr. Mallory 3 days before the fire. It is a policy for $500, insuring the barn and livestock on the McBride property against fire." If her previous testimony had been a shock, this was an earthquake. It was the missing piece, the undeniable proof of premeditation. Mallory hadn't just ordered the fire. He had planned to profit from it. The motive was no longer just intimidation. It was cold, calculated, criminal fraud. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Burke Mallory's face was a horrifying mask of rage and disbelief. He looked like a king who had just watched his throne crumble to dust beneath him. Sterling was speechless, his face pale, his case in absolute ruins. Judge Abramson hammered his gavel again and again, his voice booming over the din. "Order, I will have order." He stared down at Burke Mallory, and for the first time, Eliza saw a man who was truly afraid. The judge's voice, when he finally spoke into the ringing silence, was cold as a winter grave. "In the matter of the petition for eminent domain by the Mallory Rail and Bank, this court hereby issues a temporary injunction. All survey and construction work in the Copper Hollow Valley is to cease immediately, pending further investigation." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Then he fixed his gaze on the U.S. Marshal standing by the door. "Marshal," he commanded, his voice like the crack of a whip. "You will open a full criminal investigation into the affairs of Mr. Burke Mallory, Sheriff Clay Royce, and Mr. Harmon Pike. The charges will include, but are not limited to, conspiracy to commit fraud, insurance fraud, and arson." He pointed his gavel directly at Mallory. "And you, sir, will not leave the city of Helena. Your assets are hereby frozen. You are a person of interest in a federal criminal investigation." The final bang of his gavel echoed in the silent room like a gunshot. It was over. Amidst the pandemonium of the crowd, Eliza looked at Jonah. His face was unreadable, but she saw the tension finally release from his shoulders. He reached over and took her hand, his grip firm and steady, his calloused fingers intertwined with hers. A silent acknowledgement of the impossible thing they had just accomplished. They hadn't just saved their land. They had brought the law down on the man who thought he was above it. Looking up at the judge's bench, Eliza saw the official court seal, a brass eagle with its wings outstretched, glinting in the afternoon light. For the first time, it didn't look like an instrument of power to be used against them. It looked like a shield, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt safe. The ride back from Helena was a long, quiet affair. The vast, open country, which had seemed so fraught with menace on the journey out, now felt different, calmer, as if the land itself knew a verdict had been rendered. The victory in the courtroom had been so absolute, so shattering, that it left little room for jubilation. In its place was a profound, bone-deep weariness and the quiet, awesome gravity of what they had done. They had not just won a case, they had toppled a king. News, even in the sparsely populated territory, traveled faster than a horse. By the time they reached the outskirts of Copper Hollow, they could feel it in the air. People stopped what they were doing to watch them pass. The gazes were no longer filled with the pity or contempt Eliza had grown accustomed to, but with a new, startling mixture of awe and disbelief. They were no longer the jilted woman and the stubborn recluse. They were the slayers of a giant. They learned of Burke Mallory's escape from May Romero, who met them on the road with a basket of food and a torrent of information. Mallory hadn't waited for the Utis marshal to serve him papers. A man with his resources and connections had simply vanished in the night, his hotel bill paid, his carriage gone. He had dissolved back into the eastern mists of money and power from which he had come. He was gone, but his poison remained. The marshal had arrived 2 days prior, a grim, no-nonsense man who moved with the weight of federal authority. His first stop had been to arrest Harmon Pike. There had been no fight. Pike, stripped of Mallory's protection, was just a common bully. Levi Turner had been there to see it, standing with his arms crossed as Pike was clapped in irons, a small, satisfying smile on his weathered face. The marshal's second act, however, was the one that truly shook the town. He had found Clay Royce in the saloon, drinking in the middle of the afternoon. He hadn't raised his voice. He had simply walked up to the bar, produced the official order from Judge Abramson, and demanded Clay's badge in front of a dozen silent witnesses. Clay had been forced to unpin the symbol of his office. Eliza heard the story from 3 different people, and each telling was the same. The star-shaped badge, the very symbol of his authority and her intended future, came away with a small tear of fabric, as if it were reluctant to leave. Without it, he was diminished, his swagger gone, replaced by a pasty, slack-jawed shock. He was just Clay Royce again, a man who had sold his soul for a title he could no longer keep. He was under house arrest, facing a litany of charges that would almost certainly send him to the territorial prison. That evening, a small, impromptu gathering took place at the half-rebuilt McBride Ranch. It wasn't a celebration, not truly. It was more a collective, grateful exhalation. Samuel McBride, his face streaked with soot but his eyes clear for the first time in months, wrung Jonah's hand until his knuckles ached. Martha McBride embraced Eliza, tears of relief streaming down her face. The foal that Jonah had rescued, now steady on its long, wobbly legs, nudged at Eliza's hand, a small, living symbol of a future that had almost been extinguished. But even in this moment of quiet triumph, a new tension was building. The sky had been a heavy, oppressive gray all day, the air thick and humid. The wind, when it came, was not the usual dry scouring wind of the high plains. It was a wet, warm wind that carried the smell of distant, deluging rain. The river's running high, Jonah observed, his gaze fixed on the western peaks, which were shrouded in dark, churning clouds, higher than it should be for this time of year. His unease was contagious. The ranchers exchanged worried glances. A victory in court was a fine thing, but it meant nothing to the river. Nature was a power that could not be cross-examined or indicted. The first sign of trouble came after dark. They had all returned to their own homesteads, the gathering over. A sense of fragile peace settling over the valley. Eliza was banking the fire for the night when she heard it. It was not the sound of wind or rain. It was a deep, guttural groan from the earth itself, a low, grinding roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Jonah was already at the door, pulling on his boots. "The levee," he said, his voice grim. "The one Mallory's men built upriver to divert water for their survey lines. It's a cheap dirt wall. It won't hold." The roar grew louder, and it was soon joined by a new sound, the frantic, desperate tolling of the church bell, a wild, clanging alarm that spoke not of Sunday service, but of disaster. When they threw open the cabin door, the scale of it was terrifying. The Copper River, their lifeline, had become a monster. In the flashes of lightning that now split the sky, they could see a churning brown wall of water filled with uprooted trees and debris, surging over its banks and pouring across the low-lying pastures. The makeshift levee had burst, releasing a deluge into the valley. There was no time for thought, only for action. Lanterns began to appear like fireflies across the valley floor as families scrambled to save what they could. The greatest, most immediate danger was to the livestock in the riverside pastures. Jonah became the man he had been in the war a commander. His voice cut through the chaos, sharp and clear. "Eliza, ride to the McBrides. Get them moving their herd to the high ground east of here. I'll go for the Tolbert place."
"What about our stock?"
she cried over the roar. "They're in the upper corral. They're safe, go." What followed was a nightmare of shouting, panicked animals, and rising water. The night was a maelstrom of driving rain and flashing lightning. Eliza rode Quietude hard, the mare's powerful legs churning through mud that was quickly turning into a shallow lake. She found the McBrides already struggling, their precious cattle lowing in terror as the water swirled around their legs.
"The high ridge,"
Eliza screamed, pointing into the darkness.
"Jonah's orders. We have to push them east."
She was no longer a seamstress. She was a drover, a soldier in a desperate battle. She worked alongside Samuel, her voice raw from shouting, using her horse to wheel and drive the terrified animals away from the deepening water and toward the safety of the hills. The entire valley was in motion. It was a chaotic, desperate evacuation, but it was not without order. At the center of it, two figures emerged as anchors. May Romero, whose own home was on high ground, had established what could only be described as a command post at the crossroads. With a massive pot of coffee brewing over a hastily built fire, she was a beacon of calm in the storm, directing families toward the safest routes, handing out dry blankets, and ladling out stew and courage in equal measure. The other anchor was Levi Turner, the old lawman, who had no official authority, was organizing a watch for looters and ensuring the bridge, the only way across the now raging river, remained clear for as long as possible. He was a sheriff again, his authority drawn not from a tin badge but from the respect of his neighbors. Eliza and Jonah worked through the night, their paths crossing in the stormy darkness as they moved from one threatened homestead to the next, a team bound by a shared, unspoken purpose. They were soaked to the bone, their muscles screaming with exhaustion, but they did not stop. They pushed and pulled and drove the last of the valley's cattle to safety just as the first pale. Gray light of dawn broke through the storm clouds. The morning revealed a scene of utter devastation. The entire valley floor was a vast, muddy lake. Fences were gone, swept away. Outhouses and chicken coops had vanished. The bridge was a wreck of splintered timbers, its foundations torn away by the force of the flood. The water had crested and was beginning to recede, but it had left its brutal mark on everything. As the sun rose higher, burning through the clouds, it illuminated something extraordinary. The flood had stolen, but it had also it had left behind a blanket of the richest, darkest silt Eliza had ever seen. A layer of new life spread over the wounded fields. It was a promise. It was forgiveness from the land they had fought so hard to keep. The work of rebuilding began almost immediately. The court victory had broken Mallory's power, but it was the flood that truly broke the old ways of the valley. The rigid lines of property and self-interest had been washed away. They had survived the night not as individuals, but as a community, and they would rebuild in the same way. The first project was the bridge. Jonah, with his practical builder's mind, organized the work crews. They salvaged what timber they could and felled new pines from the hills. Samuel McBride, who had lost his barn to Mallory's fire, was the first to volunteer, his hammer ringing out with a defiant, hopeful rhythm. While the men worked on the bridge, Eliza, May, and the other women took on a different, but equally vital, project. With her father's water maps and Jonah's survey, Eliza designed a new irrigation system, not a series of private ditches, each jealously guarded, but one large central canal running from the river, with smaller arteries branching off to feed every ranch, a shared lifeline, owned and maintained by everyone. They called it the Copper Hollow Co-op. The name started as a joke from May, but it stuck. They were not just digging a ditch. They were carving a new artery into the heart of the valley. Men, women, and even the older children worked side by side, their clothes caked in the rich, dark mud. They shared tools, they shared water, and at midday, they shared the bread and stew that May brought from her tireless kitchen. One afternoon, as Eliza stood directing a team of men near the river's intake, Jonah came and stood beside her. He was covered in mud and sweat, a smudge of dirt on his cheek. He looked out at the hive of activity, at the rising skeleton of the new bridge, at the long, straight line of the new canal snaking its way across the valley floor, at the dozens of people working together with a sense of common purpose she had never witnessed before. "You know," he said, his voice quiet amidst the noise of hammers and shovels, "when I first came here after the war, all I wanted was to be left alone, to build my fences high and keep the world out." He looked down at her, a slow, weary smile touching his lips. "You turned out to be a terrible housekeeper, Eliza Hart. You let the whole damn world in." She smiled back, her heart full. "It seems to me," she said, "that we're finally building a fence big enough for all of us." He reached out and, with his thumb, gently wiped the smudge of dirt from her cheek. It was a small, simple gesture, but in the middle of their ruined and reviving valley, it felt like a benediction. Each swing of a pick, each shovelful of earth, was a vote. It was a testament written in sweat and silt, a quiet, unanimous decision to bind their futures together, not by law or by contract, but by the shared, unbreakable promise of the land itself. The autumn that followed the Great Flood was one of tireless work and quiet miracles. The new bridge, a sturdy, handsome structure of pine and sweat, spanned the placid Copper River, no longer a barrier but a link. The main irrigation canal, the artery of the co-op, carried a steady, democratic flow of water to every ranch, its banks already overgrown with new grass. The valley, scarred but not broken, was healing. The final word from Helena arrived not with a bang, but with a quiet, official-looking letter delivered by a circuit rider. Levi Turner read it aloud to the small group gathered on the steps of the general store. The injunction against the Mallory Rail and Bank was made permanent. All of Mallory's fraudulent land claims, including the one that had ensnared Eliza's father, were declared null and void. The pre-existing water rights, as recorded in custom and in the pages of a certain homesteader's ledger, were to be honored in perpetuity. Burke Mallory, tried in absentia, was found guilty on all counts. A federal warrant was issued for his arrest, but everyone knew he was long gone, a ghost who had haunted their valley and then vanished, leaving only the wreckage he had caused. Clay Royce, stripped of his authority and his pride, had accepted a plea. He was found guilty of conspiracy and dereliction of duty. The sentence was not prison, but a form of living death in the West. He was legally barred from holding any public office or position of trust within the Montana and Wyoming territories for the rest of his life. He had sold his name for power, and in the end, the court had taken both. He was last seen riding east, a man with no future and a past he couldn't outrun. With the legal battles finally laid to rest, the people of Copper Hollow turned their full attention to the land. The flood's gift of rich silt, combined with the shared water from the new canal, yielded a harvest unlike any the valley had ever seen. The fields were heavy with corn and wheat. The kitchen gardens overflowed with squash and beans, and the cattle, fat and content on the high pastures, were ready for market. It was May Romero's idea to hold a festival. "A harvest is a promise kept," she declared, "and this year the land kept its promise. We ought to say thank you." And so they did. The first annual Copper Hollow Co-op Harvest Festival was held in the wide, open meadow beside the new bridge. It was a celebration born not from a proclamation, but from a collective, grateful heart. The air was crisp and cool, smelling of wood smoke, roasting meat, and May's legendary apple pies. Someone had brought a fiddle, and Samuel McBride, a man Eliza had only ever seen with the weight of the world on his shoulders, proved to have a surprisingly light touch with a reel. Laughter, a sound that had been in short supply for so long, echoed through the valley. The children, their faces sticky with jam, chased each other through the tall grass. Eliza watched them, a gentle smile on her face, and her eyes fell upon the foal that Jonah had carried from the fire. It was now a handsome, spirited colt, its coat the color of rich cream. Martha McBride was leading it in a circle, a small, giggling child on its back. The sight was so full of simple, profound hope that it brought a lump to Eliza's throat, a future saved from the flames. Jonah came to stand beside her, a mug of warm cider in each hand. He passed one to her, his fingers brushing against hers. It was a familiar, comfortable touch now, a silent language they had developed in the long days of rebuilding. "It's a good day," he said, his gaze sweeping over the scene. He saw the widow Tolbert sharing a joke with Levi Turner. He saw the Navajo elder, Hoskin, sitting with his family, sharing a plate of food, an honored guest. He saw the new bridge, strong and solid, with people crossing back and forth, no longer defined by which side of the river they lived on.
It is,
Eliza agreed, her voice soft.
It feels like the first day.
Later, as the afternoon sun began to dip toward the mountains, casting long, golden shadows across the meadow, Jonah touched her elbow. "Come on," he said quietly.
"There's one more thing."
He led her away from the sounds of the fiddle and the laughter, down a familiar path toward the river. They walked in silence, the festive sounds fading behind them, replaced by the gentle murmur of the water and the rustle of cottonwood leaves in the breeze. He led her to the high, grassy bank, the place where he had found her in her ruined wedding dress, the place where she had come to watch the sunset on her old life. The world was quiet here. The river flowed on, a steady, unbothered presence. The sky was beginning its slow, magnificent transformation into the colors of evening. Jonah turned to face her. He was not a man of grand gestures or eloquent speeches. His heart was like the valley itself, rugged and quiet, but with a deep, sustaining strength. He reached into his pocket and pulled out not a ring of gold or silver, but a simple length of ribbon. It was the color of burnished copper, the color of the river at sunset, the color of the rich earth beneath their feet. "I don't have a church for you, Eliza," he began, his voice a low, earnest rumble. "No preacher, no fancy dress. Lord knows, you've had enough of that to last a lifetime." He looked into her eyes, and she saw in their gray depths the entire story of their journey. The fire, the flood, the fear, and the quiet, unshakable trust they had built in the ruins. "All I have is this place," he continued, gesturing to the land around them, "and a promise that I will stand with you, that I will build with you, that I will face whatever comes by your side." He held up the copper-colored ribbon. "What we've made here, it wasn't built on a legal document. It was built on work, on choosing to show up for each other. That's all I know how to offer." Tears welled in Eliza's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow or loss. They were tears of a profound, quiet joy. She thought of the woman who had stood on this very spot, a desperate, broken creature waiting for a sign from a silent sky. She thought of the carefully constructed life that had been torn away, leaving her bare and exposed, and of the stronger, truer life she had been forced to build in its place. She took a step closer, her hand covering his over the simple ribbon. "It's all I want, Jonah." He took her left hand and, with a gentle, calloused touch. He carefully tied the copper ribbon around her fourth finger, making a soft, simple knot. It was not a binding contract. It was a marker, a quiet, humble symbol of a union forged not in a church, but in the heart of the wilderness. A love born not of courtship, but of shared survival. The sun touched the horizon, and the sky ignited in a final, brilliant blaze of orange and rose. The light washed over them, bathing them in its warm, fleeting glory. Eliza looked from the knot on her finger to the beautiful, dying light in the west, and a peaceful, radiant smile spread across her face.
I don't have to wait for any more sunsets,
she said, her voice full of a quiet, wondering peace. Jonah's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her skin. He looked at her, the woman who had taught him how to let the world back in, the woman who was as strong and resilient as the river itself. Because every morning, he replied, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. We choose each other. He leaned in and kissed her, a long, slow kiss that was both a promise and a prayer. It was a kiss that tasted of cider and wood smoke, of new beginnings and hard-won peace. The river flowed on. The fiddles played in the distance, and in the heart of the valley they had saved together. Two people, bound by a simple copper ribbon, stood as one, ready to greet the dawn. Thank you so much for listening to our story tonight. We would love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Night, and give this video a like. And if you'd like to help this story reach more people, please consider hitting that hype button to show your support.